My name is Dr. Daniel Gilford. I'm a climate scientist at Climate Central.
And to start off, can you give me a little bit of the history? What do we know about, climate change and hurricanes? I know it's still something we're studying actively.
Yeah, so just to step back a little bit, we know that human beings have been increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere since the beginning of the pre-industrial revolution. With those increased greenhouse gases comes an increase in heat in the atmosphere. In particular, the atmosphere warms up, and that also tends to get down in the oceans, warming them as well. And as we've increased our amount of emissions, sort of the blanket that surrounds our Earth that warms it has been increasing in thickness. That increased temperature means a host of things for our climate system, but it happens to directly affect hurricanes because they exist in the environment that has been changed by human beings through climate change.
And so, can we link any part of this recent storm to climate change, or do we need to just keep it at a very wide scale?
Yeah, so let me step back and then talk a little bit about some of the most important things when it comes to hurricanes and climate. So hurricanes are very simply heat engines. They take energy from the ocean's surface and they convert that energy into kinetic energy in the form of winds. So when you have an increased fuel source, that is the sea surface temperatures that are just below the hurricane, when they are warmer, there is more fuel available to the hurricane. Basically, you increase the speed limit at which the hurricane can spin. And so we know that we have seen this very consistently over the past 40 years, increasing sea surface temperatures, especially in the Atlantic Ocean, but also across the world, mean that there's more fuel source available to the hurricanes to draw upon. And with that, we have seen evidence in the past few years, especially, that there is an increased rate of Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes, these so-called major hurricanes that are making landfall at a pretty dramatic clip and doing a lot of damage. They have more fuel to draw upon, so they can become more drastic and more intense. And so we see this very clearly in the data over the last 40 years. There's a study by Jim Cosson that just went through that just a year or two ago. There's also other connections between hurricanes and climate. We know that hurricanes are moving about 10% slower in this changed world because of the circulation changes in the atmosphere related to climate change. That sort of slowdown in hurricane speeds as they move across land, especially, means more dramatic rainfall. Because if a hurricane sits over you for a longer period of time, you get things like what happened in my yard, where I had over 11 inches of rain. I have a rain gauge in my yard. I couldn't keep track of the rain because it had overflowed the top of my rain gauge because I had so much rain overhead, and the storm took a long time to travel over my home. That is consistent with what we expect with under climate change, these slower storms.
And
Additional, oh,
sorry.
I was going to say one final link between climate and hurricanes, which is really clear, is that as we increase the amount of temperature of the atmosphere itself can hold more water. And that means it's about 10% or 11% maybe increased water per degree Fahrenheit of atmospheric warming. And we see that with this recent storm, a colleague of mine, Kevin Reed out of Stony Brook, showed that with Hurricane Ian, we expect that climate change contributed an additional 10% more water to the storm. That was a sort of a rapid attribution study that Kevin just performed. So we actually have a clear link between Hurricane Ian and climate change already that we have studied.
That's pretty cool. Another thing I know that we've been seeing more of is like the rapid intensification of storms. Can you touch a little bit on that and what that is if people don't know what that means?
Yeah, so hurricanes, as they're sort of growing, they go through an entire life cycle. And if there's more fuel available to the hurricanes, they can draw upon that and rapidly intensify from, say, a category 1 or 2 storm all the way up to a category 4 or 5 storm. There's sort of this tipping point where a hurricane can transition between these lower level categories and these higher level categories. And we know that as the ocean and the atmosphere both warm, the chances of this rapid intensification taking place and the storm sort of very quickly becoming a Category 4 or Category 5 storm will go up with increased atmospheric and ocean temperatures. This is something that we see in the data. It's been borne out, and there is a very strong chance that at least the environment was conducive for a hurricane to rapidly intensify, which indeed it did.
Is there any uncertainty in your research in this area? Are there things you still want to learn more about as we continue to learn more about what our changing climate is going to do?
Yeah, so when we look at the human causes of climate change and how those impact hurricanes, we have a clear grasp on how we have affected the environment in which these hurricanes are born and then grow and then thrive. And as they make landfall, that means more damage downstream on the communities like mine that are affected. But there's still some open questions that we're looking into. We don't know, for instance, whether or not there will be more or less hurricanes in the future related to climate change. That's still an open question that we're working on to sort of nail down. But we have and for any given particular storm, it is a challenge. It is a heavy computational and scientific lift to understand its direct connection to climate change, like whether or not it in particular spun faster because of climate change. We know the environments are much more conducive to that. And so climate has in fact affected the way in which these storms are growing. But any particular storm, it's kind of more difficult to more difficult to say. But we can say with Ian, for instance, we know that it is getting more wet, that it had more water that fell out of the sky onto our communities here in Florida because of human caused climate change. And we know that it had a higher chance of rapidly intensifying just as it did. So there's still open questions, but we do have a fairly good grasp on how the environments of hurricanes are changing and what that could mean for our coastal communities. It means more risk.
I,
The other thing that's important to note is that human beings are living in these environments more readily. They are exposing themselves more to the impacts of climate change and especially hurricanes as they move to locations that are more sort of vulnerable to tropical cyclone impacts. And that also increases the risks.
that was something I was just about to ask you about. It's unfair to talk about how much damage if you also don't acknowledge the population growth in these vulnerable communities, I feel. So I
That's
appreciate that.
absolutely the case.
Is there anything else I missed? So the viewer that had asked this question mentioned hurricanes. We've had stronger hurricanes. The Labor Day one, 185-mile-per-hour winds. Um, we can't neglect those storms, obviously. What do you say to people who kind of bring up previous storms that had maybe been had stronger winds?
Yeah, certainly in an environment where there are no human beings whatsoever, hurricanes would still occur and would still be striking the coastline of Florida and other places along the US coast. That is certainly the case. But we know now that hurricanes are becoming more strong and intensifying more rapidly because of human caused climate change. We can't bury our head in the sands on this. We are seeing that Category 4 and Category 5 storms are now more frequent. Storms are rapidly intensifying with increased sea surface temperatures, and they are wetter and dropping 10% plus more rain on individual locations, just like Hurricane Ian did. Yes, we've had storms in the past, but we haven't had them at the same clip that we're seeing them right now. And we haven't had them with as much water raining out of them or moving as slowly as we're seeing right now. So, yes, storms have occurred in the past, of course, but we are now more exposed as a population by living in these vulnerable areas, and these storms have gotten worse, and their impacts are more damaging on our communities as a result of the increased risks of vulnerability and physical changes in our climate system. These hurricanes are worse because of climate change.
Is there anything that I missed or anything else that you'd want people to know coming off of this pretty big storm?
I don't think so.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your time. This was really helpful. Yeah, I really appreciate it. And it was nice to meet you.
It was nice to meet you as well. Please feel free to reach out anytime.
Thank you. Good luck with the rest of your cleanup. I wish you guys the best.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's nice to meet you, Danielle.
You as well. Bye bye.